Welcome to Why Rocks. We are here today with Dr. Ron Harris, professor in the Department of Geological Sciences.
My love for Indonesia started just through reading about the active tectonics of Indonesia, about all the active faults, how there were more earthquakes and more active volcanoes, more tsunamis than any other country in the world.
Ron, how long you been in the Department of Geological Sciences at BYU?
I
know, starting out with the hard
A
questions.
little over 20 years, yeah.
20 years. What seems like longer, though, right?
No. Nope, it's actually gone by really fast.
Ron's area of expertise and research involves geological hazards, specifically earthquakes and tsunamis. Dr. Harris enjoys skiing. He used to enjoy surfing. Do you still enjoy surfing?
I can't see the waves now.
You can't see the waves now, yes. And I'm supposed to ask him something unique about himself, and I know that everybody listening and watching wants to know. Dr. Harris, would you tell us about the monkey that stole your glasses?
Well, that was the least of our problems with stealing our glasses. We had monkeys rolling rocks at us and all kinds of things.
What did you do to upset these monkeys?
Just being in their territory.
Were the glasses on your head?
Yes.
So he came down from a tree or a vine?
And it had a lanyard on him as well.
And he just snatched him away.
Went up in the tree, and fortunately the lanyard caught a branch.
So yes, Dr. Harris is the only person that I know personally who's had his glasses stolen by a monkey. Geological hazards. At what point in your history, during your schooling or before, did you become interested in this specific topic?
After I had been a professional for probably 5 or 6 years,
Okay.
What directed me that way was that I wanted to understand active tectonic processes so I could understand ancient ones. To really study active processes, you have to go to some very underdeveloped areas of the planet. I noticed that there were lots of people, very densely populated countries, that also had lots of earthquakes, lots of tsunamis, lots of explosive volcanoes, landslides, floods, typhoons. Many, many people were dying. And so to try to reduce the losses to nature, I thought, I've got the expertise that we can try to help the people know how to live with the hazards, because moving them out of the way is just not an option.
Right. How well received, how hard is it when you go into an area and you try to explain to these people who've lived on this land for generation after generation after generation that this is not a safe place?
Fortunately, there's historical accounts, and there's also, in some cases, stories that get passed down from generation to generation. So it's not just that they're not aware of them. There's also low-level activity reminding them that they live on an active fault. The problem is, like us, if there's no immediacy, it's really easy to just put off.
How long have you been doing research in Indonesia?
Since 1987.
Okay. So let's go back in time for just a second. It's Boxing Day. It's the day after Christmas, 2004. What was that morning like at your house?
It's always hard for me to talk about this.
I don't do what you do. I've never been to Sumatra, and it's hard for me to think about it.
Well, it was a very, very, very difficult emotional, not just day, but actually year.
Yeah.
I was so depressed because we had just published a paper in 2002 warning
That this was going to happen.
that this was going to happen. We didn't know when, and most geologists never get a chance to actually see what they forecast happen because Earth's processes are so slow. So this happened 2 years after we published that paper, and I had to realize, the press all came. How did you predict this? And I said, we didn't predict it. We forecast it, first of all, and we didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. Why didn't the people listen to you? Well, we did what most people were doing back then. We assessed it, and then we gave it to somebody else thinking that they would bring it to the people. But there's nobody in between, in that space, in between science and what the people need to do to reduce risk.
Yeah, the people that live on the coastline, don't read the scientific journals.
They they don't have access to them,
Yes,
first of all.
yeah.
Even if they did, they were in English. And even if they could read the English, they're in science, technical
terms.
language. And so it requires someone who can take the science and communicate it effectively to those in harm's way and then help them implement change. You have to be at both ends. And I saw that there was a huge gap there. And so I decided, man, this is my calling in life. I've got the skills that I can help these people, and we can work in this gap, try to bridge it.
So prior to 2004, you were more just on the scientific side of the problem. Post 2004,
Right.
you're trying to be that voice in the middle,
That's right.
educating the people.
It was assessment before, which is still important, but it's only one of the three ways in which you can reduce the disaster potential. Assessment, and then communication of the assessment, and then implementation of risk reduction strategies.
What was it like going back after the devastation?
Well, we didn't go to Sumatra because it had already happened there, and we had already blown it. Essentially, we had published a paper. We delegated to somebody else to take the message, the communication part. So the forecasting, we got probably an A in, although it was much larger than we forecast. So we'll say an A minus.
Yeah, almost a 9.2.
Was a 9.2.
9.2.
We said 8 plus.
Right.
So we were
Missed it by an order of
two
magnitude.
orders of magnitude.
Yes, 2 orders of magnitude.
Well, yeah, at least one. So then the communication part and the implementation part, we just left for somebody else to do. Now we have taken all of the tsunami science and reduced it into 3 numbers, 20, 20, 20. And if the people then would have known that after 20 seconds of shaking, that's a big enough earthquake that it produce a tsunami. And if you're on the coast, you have 20 minutes to evacuate to 20 meters elevation above sea level. And the Indonesian government adopted it in 2020.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
They made a big deal about it. But if they just would have known that, they could have self-evacuated.
And how many people would that have saved?
Tens of thousands of people. Most people had no idea what a tsunami was.
Yeah, you watch the videos on YouTube and the sea was going out as that bulge of water, the mound is building offshore from the wavelength, and they're running towards it.
Right, because there's fish out there flipping around.
Come back home now. You're somewhere. I don't know if you were in your office or if you were at home, and you got a phone call from Temple Square.
Right.
And President Hinckley wanted to meet with you.
Yeah.
Tell us about that meeting. I've never had lunch with President Hinckley. So how did that meeting go?
Well, my expectations were that I would, go in there, they'd be looking at their watch because,
Yeah, busy people.
get in and get out. They joked around for like 15 minutes after I
Really?
got there. President Hinckley, when I walked in, was like, "Will our hearts be still once when the ground begins to shake? Will our hearts be still?" And President Faust talked about how he was in an earthquake in Central America. It was a 7.5, but it wasn't that bad. And my question was, "Well, how close were you to the epicenter?" "Oh, we were a long ways away."
That's why it wasn't so bad.
I didn't say that,
Yeah.
but I think he understood.
Might have reprimand the first presidency.
No. But one thing we talked about was BYU housing,
Okay.
what used to be called Deseret Towers.
You are now known as the man who got Deseret Towers torn down. Tell us about that.
Well, I think they were aware of it, but they just needed to be reminded that, there'd be lots of students that will die if we don't do anything about student housing. It's not just Deseret Towers, it's most of them. I had been working through BYU risk management, and nothing was being done. I mean,
Just like in Sumatra.
yeah. And then as soon as I talked to President Hinckley, all of a sudden it was announced that they were going to tear down those death trap towers, is what I used to call them. They're down. I think it's a win-win situation because they were old and needed to be redone anyway. But now I think parents feel a lot better about them being. But the married student housing, nothing's been done about it.
No, the ones up by the temple, nothing's been done. I mean, the Helaman halls, they opened that up, gutted it,
Yeah.
fortified it, put it back
Right.
together.
Mm-hmm.
But that could be brought up to code where Deseret Towers.
But BYU's been very progressive in that way. In like right now, they're finally redoing the Harris Fine Arts Center. They're tearing it down.
We were just in a meeting yesterday, and there was a faculty who made the remark, "Oh, don't tear down Harris Fine Arts Center. I love the Harris Fine Arts Center." And you said,
I said, I'm so glad that they finally realized it's a death trap.
"Yeah, there's a sign in this building when we walked in today that says 1975."
1975.
Yeah. So what's the earthquake code like on the structural integrity of this part of the library?
Nobody in the world knew how to build for earthquakes in 1975 as much as we know now. I mean, they would reinforce concrete, but they wouldn't like wrap extra reinforcement around the rebar, and you would still get collapse of those structures, and even structures that are built in the 90s. Some of them just weren't constructed properly. They were designed right, but not constructed. So there's a lot of risk. We have this part of the library. We also have the old part of the Wilkinson Center,
Yeah.
and we still have the engineering building.
Yes.
I don't know why that wasn't torn down.
And those are the engineers.
I know. They knew it was bad. But other than that, I think most of the buildings on campus probably will not collapse. Well, I just had a couple students actually go to every single dwelling and document when it was built and if it was renovated and how many students live there. 75% of our students off campus live in homes that were built before 1970.
Now, these are the old brick homes.
Some of them were built around the turn of the century.
Right. And as a population, as a culture, we kind of get enamored with those old houses, and we put them on the historical registry. Good idea, bad idea?
Well, we should retrofit them like what happened to the Provo Tabernacle and what happened to the Provo Library.
Okay.
That's what we need to do to preserve them.
Right.
There's no reason to put them on the registry if they're going to collapse.
So right now, today, basically, still as an ongoing response to your meeting with President Hinckley, what's going on up at Temple Square?
Well, I was so impressed that President Nelson went into the basement and showed everybody during General Conference that this is a real threat, to the point where they've completely redone the temple. I asked him about what their plans were for the temple. And President Hinckley's like, "Oh, well, I hope the earthquake doesn't happen on my watch." And he was right.
It didn't, yes.
But still,
It's going to happen on somebody's watch.
essentially, he kicked the can down the hallway, right?
President Nelson's going, "Hey, thanks, Gordon."
That's right. But he did it. And it's ironic that right after they announced this project and started doing it, there was a small earthquake in Magna that knocked Angel Moroni off.
Yeah, and he lost his trumpet.
Lost his trumpet, yeah.
Unfortunately, there was no fatalities or...
It was only a 5.7.
Yeah, 5.7. Explain for just a second, how does that work? A 5.7, you've mentioned that you were in a 7.5, Sumatra was a 9.2. How does that scale work?
So it's an exponential scale. A 5.7 is 10 times less than a 6.7. You have 10 5.7s that happen at once. If you have a 6.7, 7.7, 100 times. 8.7, 1,000 times. 9.7, which we've never had. We've had a 9.5, but not a 9.7.
What kind of earthquake are we looking at here, locally?
Well, unfortunately, we're looking at one of the most destructive types of earthquakes that could happen, because it's going to be shallow, just like what occurred in Turkey. It's going to be less than 15 kilometers down, and because of the inclination of the fault going right underneath the valley, the epicenter is going to be where all the people are. There's going to be people within 15 kilometers of where it actually ruptures underground.
Where President Faust was hundreds of kilometers away.
Yeah. There's going to be an amplification effect because most of the built environment is on unconsolidated material, which means that the seismic wave, when it hits that, is going to slow down, which means the amplitude is going to go way up. And probably based on our measurements, there's places in the valley that will amplify the seismic waves up to 6 times.
6 times amplitude for the surface waves.
And that's where most people live.
Yeah, Brigham Young said, "This is the place."
Yeah, he was right, because he was talking about earthquakes.
Let's talk about recent events. 2.5 weeks ago, the Earth broke apart, and tens of thousands of people paid the price. What happened in Turkey?
Well, the same thing there. You have a valley in the middle of mountains, but the reason the valley is there is because of an active fault. That area had been accumulating energy for over probably almost 1,000 years.
So no big earthquake for almost 1,000 years.
Yeah, because it's stuck.
So the amount of strain on the fault is just mind-boggling.
Right. And so it ruptured, 7.8 earthquake, shallow, and most of the buildings weren't built to seismic code, if any. It was so large that there were other faults in the region that hadn't slipped for a long time. And so it increased the likelihood that those were going to slip earlier than they would normally do, because they were loaded with stress from the 7.8.
Because there was a 7.5
on another fault.
Just a few hours later.
8 hours later.
And then we've had aftershocks approaching us.
Another 6.8. And those were in zones where you have stress loading from the 7.8. Now, we have the same thing here. We've done those kind of models for the Wasatch Front. And the most likely, unfortunately, the most likely segment of the Wasatch Fault to rupture will be the Salt Lake City segment. So many things go across the fault. Communication lines. This is one of President Hinckley's biggest worries. He says, what's going to happen to the communication lines? I go, well, if they go across the fault, they're going to rupture. I mean, the valley is going to drop 2.5 meters, almost 9 feet.
Instantaneously.
Near the speed of sound.
And you've not only communications, water lines,
gas lines,
sewer lines,
fires, floods.
San Francisco, 1906. Boy, you were just full of daisies and butterflies today, Dr. Harris.
It's something we need to take seriously. And this is the thing. We talk about natural disasters, but are they really natural disasters, or are they crises that find the people unready for them? So they're really human disasters.
There's a lot of talk along that line in Turkey right now that contractors have been able to, for decades, even though Turkey has some semblance of an earthquake code, they've been able to pay a fee to the government, which to me kind of sounds like a bribe, and get out of those earthquake codes.
Yeah, depends on who you know. And it's not just in Turkey.
Really?
Yeah.
Do we have similar problems?
We have similar problems here. Yep. Corruption isn't just there.
So we would have old buildings fail, of course, but we could also possibly have new buildings where people think they're safe.
Because they weren't constructed properly.
So why can't we predict when it's going to happen?
There's just too many variables. Every time an earthquake occurs on a fault zone, the fault zone changes, and the stress changes in the area. And those things are really hard to model. It's a very complex process.
In China, in the early to mid-1970s, there was an earthquake, mid-7s, around the town of
Tungshun.
Oh, the one before that, around Haicheng, where they kind of predicted the earthquake and they evacuated the city about 2 weeks before the earthquake happened.
Right.
Did they just get lucky?
Some people think so, but they also had so many people making observations. Many times after the earthquake, we'll look at like the water table and see that it actually went down a few days before, or that there were chlorine gases coming out that were unusual right before the event, or other things. And so they were monitoring all of that. Anything that could, animal behavior, they were monitoring.
How does that work? I mean, what animals are we talking about?
Snakes.
Snakes don't like earthquakes. And somehow they can sense?
Probably the radon that's being let out of the soil
as the
stress, as the microfractures start to coalesce.
Okay. But China, you said they had Lots of people making observations.
Yeah, citizen science. It's a great example of that. The fact that they actually did it and were able to evacuate the people has never been replicated. But they didn't document what they did, and that's the problem. We can't look at it critically and see if it's going to be repeatable.
But then you fast forward, like you had brought up, to 1976, July, the town of Tangshan.
Yeah.
I'm probably saying that incorrectly.
Yeah.
They didn't forecast that one.
No.
And
they had just as many observers.
And the unofficial death toll is somewhere in the 600,000 range.
Yeah.
Making it probably the largest single loss of human life ever to occur in one instant on the planet.
Right. Yeah.
And here in Utah, in Provo, in Utah County, how many people do we have looking besides you? Or are you and your 3 students? That's it. That's the whole army checking the water table and the radon gas emissions.
Well, we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're trying to determine which areas are most at danger and trying to get something done about them. Because moving people away is not going to work. And so we need to destroy the bad buildings, the ones that are not stable, I shouldn't say bad, but just unstable ones, and build new ones.
Earthquake preparation instead of earthquake prediction.
Yeah. The really tough questions are, is the building that you're living in and working in going to survive? As long as it doesn't collapse, you're fine, right? But we have over 100,000 unreinforced masonry buildings just in Utah Valley, and another 100,000 or more. Another in Salt Lake Valley. So in the whole Rift Valley we live in, it is a rift valley. The valley wasn't formed by a river. It was formed by earthquakes. We have over 200,000 buildings that usually do not behave very well when they get shaken. Like in most big earthquakes, you've had 85% of them, destroyed, and at least 30 to 40% of them collapse. Now, there's something that we can do that's very simple that should be replicated all over the valley, and that is there's earthquake alarms.
A P-wave monitor.
Mm-hmm. The P-wave you can't feel, but it will feel. It's a pendulum that hangs between 2 sensors. And so, like when the Magna earthquake occurred, my earthquake alarm went off.
Because you have a P-wave monitor.
Before the shaking started. I was so excited. I started counting.
The only man who gets a smile on his face when an earthquake happens.
Yeah, I started counting. I was like, I can figure out how far away it is.
Right.
Right?
Because the difference in travel times.
Right. And so that would give people a few seconds.
But of course, we must have something like that, let's say in our grade schools or our junior highs to protect our students.
We don't.
You are kidding.
And they're like, you could get a mass. I've done this in Indonesia. They're starting to actually produce them themselves because they didn't want to buy them for $35 each.
They're only $35.
So if every kid in the classroom, since we have 35 kids in a classroom, a dollar,
every classroom in Utah could have a P-wave monitor.
They could.
Without any difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we spend money on so many other less important things.
Yep.
I've heard a rumor, and I've never actually asked you about it, but I heard that one night while you were asleep at your house, you're smiling, your P-wave monitor fell off the wall or something like that.
Well, it went off. And I was laying there counting. And I'm like, after I got to like 20 to 25, I'm like, there's no way that I wouldn't feel the S waves by that time, right? And so I got up, and there it was laying on the ground.
Yeah, that's not as entertaining as I'd heard that you were running around in the street in your bathrobe telling people to evacuate. The
sky is falling. The sky is falling.
The stories get better and better over time. They truly do.
Yeah.
Well, that's too bad. Are there any P-wave monitors on campus here at BYU?
No, I have one in my office.
One P-wave monitor in the entirety of campus. And we're in a building that's made out of masonry, and it was built in 1975, and there's no P-wave monitor.
Right. And all you'd have to do is periodically go over and flick it with your finger, and it would go off, and people would be like, "What's that?" And you could explain it to them. And then you could have a little discussion as to what you should do when you hear that noise.
Seems like for not much expense, a lot less than we would spend, let's say, on new football helmets. You could put a P-Wave monitor in almost every classroom on campus, and once every 2 or 3 years, you could come and speak at the forum and explain how they worked. Our time's getting close to the end. You just spent a portion of fall semester 2022 in Indonesia.
Right.
Tell us what you were doing.
We were measuring seismic waves. In some cases, we were making our own ones so we can measure them, but we were also measuring background seismic waves to determine their velocity through the ground. If they go slow, that means that the energy is going to be amplified. If they go fast, then you don't have to worry as much. We had already made a map with the values, and we were essentially extending those values outward to other parts of the country. But in that city where we had the values, they had an earthquake in 2018. There was a brand new hospital. I mean, we're talking about, a place that doesn't have a lot of resources, and they have a beautiful new hospital that they built right in an area that showed 7 times amplification of seismic waves, instead of up on the hill where you have no amplification because the bedrock's really close. And guess what happened? Even though the earthquake was only like a 5.7 and it was over 100 kilometers away, you had so much amplification there. Nobody else felt the shaking, but that hospital was just going up and down and sideways. And I asked if there was any damage to it. No, everybody said no. But I was suspicious, so we went over there, and it's all cracked. The whole thing is cracked.
So another earthquake.
Oh, even smaller would cause it to collapse. They didn't want to hear that.
No, nobody wants to hear that you've made bad choices. Hopefully, the state legislature one day enacts some kind of law that says every school child needs to bring $1 to school today so that we can put P-Wave monitors in all of the classrooms so we can protect the youth.
Right.
It just seems like a no-brainer to me.
I have a nonprofit called In Harm's Way, and we actually provide, depending on the place and the classroom, we're starting to actually use it as a way of funding that. And so if people want to make a donation, they can go to inharmswayhelp.com. And the money that we get, there's no administration fees or anything. We devote that to strategies that will really, really reduce the losses. So far, we've saved over 7,000 lives that we can document, and a lot of undocumented ones.
On your email, just as we finish up, down at the very bottom, when you send out an email, it says,
an ounce of prevention is better than tons of disaster relief.
And I think we're seeing that borne out right now in Turkey.
Yeah. And it'll happen again. Turkey's a repeat offender. They know better. They've had
bounded
4
by faults on
earthquakes.
multiple sides of the country.
Yeah, 4 earthquakes in the past that have had 25,000 deaths.
Or more.
Yeah, and this one's going to be probably close to 50.
They've passed 50 as of this morning.
Yeah.
We're pleased to have Dr. Ron Harris with us today to talk about earthquakes preparedness, to use the terminology that his nieces and nephews do. Dr. Ron Indiana Jones Harris, thank you for being here today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us today on Why Rocks, a BYU Geology Department podcast.